hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. This is a fireside chat with Sarah Leary from Nextdoor. Let's have a round of applause. Come on.
Oh, yay.
Hope you're all having a great time at TOA. Wonderful weather we're having, as usual, in Berlin. Sarah, it's fantastic that you've come over from, you're San Francisco based at the moment, right?
That's correct.
Originally a Bostonian, I gather.
Grew up outside of Boston, yes.
Now, Nextdoor is making kind of a push at the moment into international markets, but you've coming from a very strong base in the US, aren't you? You've got hundreds of thousands of neighborhoods.
About 176,000 neighborhoods across the United States. And just to put that into perspective, that represents 88% of all the neighborhoods in the US. We started in 2011, so we've been at this for several years, and based on the success that we had in the US, we started expanding internationally about 2 years ago, first in the Netherlands, and then in the UK, Germany, and France.
Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at the rise of social networks, you know, initially they were about connecting people in from disparate areas. You know, it didn't really matter where you were on the planet. You would get a Facebook account or a Twitter account or whatever. But you took an extremely different tack, trying to reconnect neighborhoods, physical neighborhoods with each other, with the you know, the neighbors in the neighborhood. Surely that was an extremely hard, tough call to make, given how, you know, it's sort of slightly counterintuitive, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up. When we started Nextdoor, we looked across the landscape, and you're right, there are social networks for all these different parts of our lives. We have Facebook for our friends and family, LinkedIn for your professional networks. You can even think of Twitter as connecting you to people and topics of interest. And what really inspired us was we felt like there was a part of our lives that was really important that was not being well served by technology. And that was the place where you live, your local life, where kids go to school, where you have a home. And why hadn't we found a way to use technology as a way to connect us with the people who live right down the street? We've used it to connect ourselves with people all over the globe, but why not the people right down the street? And I think one of the really interesting things was that we found that over the course of the last 30 or 40 years, people have lost touch with their local community. And a lot of that has to do with longer commute times, both parents working outside the home, and in fact, technology that is pulling people away. And
written at
flip
length
it on its head and use it to bring people together was a little bit counterintuitive, and a lot of people said that's going to be really hard to do.
Yeah, but it was written a lot about psychologists such as Putnam's Bowling Alone and things like, you know, whole works written about,
we were heavily influenced by Professor Robert Putnam and his book Bowling Alone.
Yeah.
And for those of you who may not have read it, he basically talks about these tangible costs to society of not having connection with people in your local community. And so for us, we, as technologists, as people who understood how to build online community, we said, well, can't we use technology as a way to help people lower the barrier to start the conversation with their neighbors and therefore follow their natural instincts to reconnect with one another? And we have been blown away with the response. I think there's a true human need that people have to feel connection with the people who live around them. And we've seen that in the United States, in the UK, in the Netherlands, Germany, France. It's not something that is regional, it's something that is universal. And I think it's part of the reason why we've seen such success. But it didn't happen easily, and I'll tell you that.
It didn't happen easily. Well, first of all, actually, you started to build one product, and that failed, and you basically were about to give the money back to your investors. Tell us that story. The pivot story.
Thanks for bringing that up. I love talking about our failure, but it's a really important one for the founding of Nextdoor, especially for anyone who's an entrepreneur out there. We had started to build one company, and after about a year and a half, We didn't think that we were solving an important problem that needed to be addressed. We didn't think it would be a success. And you're right, we offered to give the money back to our original investor. And they said, no, we bet on the team, and why don't you take the next 3 months and think about new ideas and see if you can get inspired about something else. And we spent several weeks working on new ideas. One of those ideas was what eventually became Nextdoor. And it really came out of a problem that we were each having in our own lives, in this case for us in San Francisco. Here I was living in San Francisco at the time for about 6 years, and I only knew 2 of the neighbors in my neighborhood. And that was not the way that I grew up in New England, outside of Boston. I knew my neighbors growing up. And here I was in a place that I didn't know my neighbors, and the same was true with my co-founders. And that's when we started to get inspired about thinking how we could use technology to reconnect people. But I think at the heart of it was a real sense of figuring out how to come up with an idea and test it and iterate it as many times as possible before you bring it to market. And right. I think that was the big learning that we really figured out the second time around, and it was part of what has made Nextdoor so successful.
But there have been other attempts to create a Nextdoor-style local social network, haven't there? In the UK, we had Street Life, which I think you actually ended up acquiring. Why do you think Nextdoor has managed to be successful where others have failed?
It's interesting you bring that up. When we started Nextdoor in the United States, there were actually dozens of small companies that were trying to tackle how do we connect people in their local life. And I think one of the things that we figured out how to do early on was to actually respect that these are real communities that exist in your daily life. And that you have to think about building something that maybe you start the conversation online, but ultimate success is actually getting together in the real world with your neighbors. And so when we understood this and sitting down and talking with literally dozens and dozens of communities across the United States, we heard this time and time again. These are real world communities that exist in their real lives. And so when we thought about it, we thought that it was very important that when you join Nextdoor, that you needed to use your real name identity. And that's important because once I walk outside my front door, let's say I've had a conversation online, if then I see you and I see you with your dog and we've been talking about how we both have dogs, I want to be able to address you as Mike, not as some handle that obscures your real identity. And so we thought about that from the very, very beginning. We also thought a lot about the boundaries. So on Nextdoor, every neighborhood has a defined boundary and a name. And that was something that we heard very early on, that these communities have an identity. And they want to be able to talk about it. If I ask you, where do you live? You're going to give me a name of a place, right. Probably in London that you live. And that's a sense of your identity. Yeah. It's a part of who you are.
Is there also a certain, is there also a kind of a legal aspect to that, like a safety aspect? That you want to have real identities?
Well, for us, we think about it as privacy being at the core. So in order to join a Nextdoor neighborhood, you have to be able to verify that you live within the boundary. And that was the other thing that was very important, that was very different for Nextdoor than anyone else, was that you had to verify that you lived within the boundary before you could join. And if you just think about, if you're a tech entrepreneur and you think about funnels and moving people through the funnel as quickly as possible, the idea of putting these checkpoints along the way that you have to use your real name, you have to give us your address, and you have to verify your identity, all those sound like places where conversion rate's going to go down.
Yeah, they're surely going to drop off a cliff.
But we do those very intentionally because we want to make sure that each person who joins Nextdoor knows that they're talking with their actual neighbors, that this is a private social network for your neighborhood where you can have trusted conversations with your actual neighbors. And that may seem counterintuitive in the very beginning, but it was essential to creating a trusted community that now people are using every single day to share recommendations, sell items, organize events, help each other out in times of need. And that comes about by planting the seeds and really focusing on the quality of the community versus just the speed of growth.
But isn't the counterpoint to that surely is that some people might actually would prefer to be private and not, you know, tell their neighbours who they are, but still interact somehow. How do you get over that hurdle?
What we see is we give people a choice about how much information about themselves that they want to share within their community. And remember, it's private to your own neighborhood. So even the surrounding neighbors can't see the full information about who you are, but the folks that live close to you can share that information.
Well, Sarah, I can reveal live to you on stage today and to the world that I have a fake profile on Nextdoor. I managed to hack the system because I have a big social media following, advert, and I thought I don't really want all my neighbours to know that it's Mike Butcher from TechCrunch, etc. I just want to be Mike from the local area. So I just put up a fake name like Mike London or something. And then it said, nope, you can't connect to your Facebook account because that's not your name, etc., etc. So, but it said, you can send a postcard. So I got the postcard to verify the address and with the fake name. So it worked.
Fake name, but your address is accurate. You actually live in that neighborhood. And you know, I can imagine a famous person like yourself trying to obscure your identity, but Mike down the street.
Yes.
And what we often see that when this happens, if you're a very active member, your own neighbors would call up and say, that's not Mike London. They would let us know. So, but we'll follow up.
Are you going to throw me off the system now? Please don't.
Just encourage you to use your real name.
It's extremely useful because I need to borrow my neighbor's lawnmower. No, I'm joking. What do you think is going to happen in the new world of blockchain and crypto? Do you think that there's going to be, because you're saying that actually people can sell, you know, their household items like the couch or the sofa or, you know, the bicycle or something to the neighbors. Now at the moment people are using apps like, you know, eBay and Depop and Spock, I think, and stuff like that, to do that sort of thing. Do you see some of that traffic starting to go through your networks in the future?
You know, the vast majority of the type of selling that happens on Nextdoor are people who are taking their household items that they're not using anymore, and they are turning around and they want to sell it to someone locally. And it's really about convenience. I think one of the interesting things about Nextdoor is about 20 to 25% of the items that are maybe in classifieds are being given away for free.
Yeah.
And I think that has to do with the convenience and also wanting to be someone who's seen in their neighborhood as giving away items for free, the goodwill. You know what, I might list this up on a classifieds and ask for $10 or 10 euros or 100 euros. But for a neighbor, if you come by, I'll give it to you for free. And so we see a lot more person-to-person type of trading that is going on. But that continues to grow. And I think one of the things that people really count on when they come to Nextdoor is that, again, you're using this verified identity. This is a neighbor who lives down the street. So you have a much higher level of confidence in the transaction versus, let's say in the United States, you might be using something like Craigslist. I'm not going to let just anyone come to my house to buy something. I'll meet you in a public place. I'll bring 2 friends with me, bring cash. That's not the way it works on Nextdoor because these are people who live around you.
And you don't want to annoy the neighbor who might come back and beat you up because they know where you live.
Well, their reputation matters, and so they want to have a good, strong transaction.
That's another way of putting it. What about, so what's the sort of going to be the monetization piece for Nextdoor? Because this doesn't really seem to run ads, or does it run ads?
So in the United States, we have been monetizing for the last year and a half, and just like anything else that we've done at Nextdoor, we test and iterate that before we expand globally. So for example, what you see is we're looking for ways to be able to help local businesses connect with local residents. Anyone who sells items or provides services locally, you can see them from time to time. They could have a spot in the news feed, for example. And so that has been going very well for us.
So this is like replacing like local newspaper ads in a way.
Yeah, you can think about it that way. Another example is that about 25% of the conversations on Nextdoor are people who are sharing recommendations for local service providers. And so we think that there's a very natural way where we could take what we would call in the United States the yellow pages and couple that with recommendations from Neighbours and allow you to create a commerce section of the site where you can learn about the great local businesses or the great local service providers. The third thing that I'll call out is that we also have a section in the United States and many parts of the country where you can see which homes are for sale in the area, so a real estate section. So that is also something that we think is very promising.
And are those kinds of monetization pieces that similarly going to be rolled out over Europe as you expand in Europe?
Those are things that we are testing in the United States, and we expect, for example, in the UK, we cover over 70% of all the neighborhoods across the United Kingdom, and we feel like it's at a place now where we can start to introduce monetization. So you'd expect to see that in the second half of this year. We will test that, iterate, and understand what works best in that market, and look at that for each of the other subsequent markets.
So you're in the UK, France, where else?
Germany and the Netherlands.
Germany and Netherlands. And you're looking at other European countries?
Other European countries and around the globe. And we certainly have seen that while there might be slight differences in what people talk about in each country, there's more similarities than there are differences. And certainly being neighborly and local community is something that we see as a universal thing that people want to build.
So you don't feel the need to tweak the product for a local, a regional or culture, say, you know, Nextdoor in Italy is going to be the same as Nextdoor in Germany, is that right?
It's really interesting. There are slight differences that we do in terms of the sign up and addresses. We certainly customize how we think about neighborhood boundaries. That is done in each area. But remember, the vast majority of what is going on in Nextdoor is user-generated content. And so it is highly customized and highly personalized to those individual communities. So what people talk about in San Francisco versus West Texas versus Birmingham versus Dusseldorf is going to be very different. But the way we've built the platform, we allow those local communities to come on board and start the conversations that matter most to them.
And I want to come back to my question earlier. Do you see a time in the future where you'll be introducing your own cryptocurrency, a sort of a local coin, a Nextdoor coin or something?
Anything is possible, but I think we're going to allow the crypto coin space to play out a little bit more. Much more likely for us, we're creating a platform of trust and proximity. And so can we create services that can sit on top of that and make transactions, recommendations, finding a home, organizing events, taking polls, engaging in civic engagement? All those things can happen on Nextdoor. What we have been focused on is building that high-quality community from the ground up in each one of the markets that we're going into, and growing those communities to allow that platform to have relevance and to have make sure you have trust and confidence.
It's interesting that you mentioned civic engagement, and of course one of the biggest conversations over the last couple of years has been, the disparate, the problems in politics where people are thrown from, far left to far right. There seems to be almost a breakdown in the conversation in culture and society. People are so extreme now to some extent. What do you feel that Nextdoor can bring to that conversation? Because it does feel like, we are in a state of, there's a lot of problems in the world right now regarding this, very, very strong opinions everyone has.
It's a great question, and interestingly for us, what we see is that there's a national conversation around politics, and then there's a different conversation that happens locally around politics. And the tenor of those conversations is actually very, very different. We launched in the UK 2 months after the Brexit vote. And
what sort of things did you see?
And what we saw was that there were a little bit of conversations about Brexit at the national level, but what we saw was a much greater focus on local politics, on their local community, because I think people felt like that was an area they had control over it. They could have input, they could have impact. And so take, for example, a lot of conversations about refugees. And you can imagine across the UK questions about this, especially post-Brexit.
And Germany as well, huge issue in Germany.
we saw a specific example in the UK where maybe there would be people who are out in the streets protesting what was going on, very heated conversation. But instead, what we would see on Nextdoor is someone would say, here is a family of refugees who've come to our country, and would anyone be willing to help? And literally dozens of families offering to help. There was one great story in the southern part of Belfast, up in Northern Ireland, where a Hungarian family had come and wanted to learn the local language. And the husband put a post out on Nextdoor saying, we'd love to learn how to speak better English, especially my wife, and in return, we will teach you how to cook Hungarian food. And literally a dozen people raised their hand and offered to help. And right outside their front door are people who are protesting refugees and Brexit. And so I think there's a real human element here that people respond to. And that example that I gave you, we see examples like that in Dusseldorf, where people are stepping up. We see it in St. Louis, Missouri. You see it in Paris. The reality is that when you take the conversation about something like Brexit or refugees, and you drive it down to the local level and the human level, people actually have really good instincts and want to be helpful. When it's abstracted into some political conversation, I think that that's where there can be some ugliness that doesn't reflect well on mankind. But what we see on Nextdoor is that people have a desire to be helpful and neighborly. They just need an easy way to connect with the people who live around them, and that's what Nextdoor provides.
Oh, I wanted to ask you, changing tack slightly, about Silicon Valley at the moment. You guys have actually been, kind of growing really from a small basis all the way up to today. You're kind of one of the original founders of Silicon Valley at this point now. How do you see the scene having changed over the last few years? Nextdoor is actually now successful. It's got huge impact in the US and is now rolling out internationally. But what do you see coming through the pipe now in Silicon Valley?
It's so interesting. Silicon Valley has so many great, wonderful things about it. I think great companies have been created. There's lots of dreams that people follow. But I also think that there's an element of, are you creating something of real value? And one of the things that was very important for us in the early days of Nextdoor was to test things not only in Silicon Valley, but across the country. So we made a point of it, of making sure, let's see if this works in Tennessee and Texas and Virginia, because
I think not just in
So you're not in the echo chamber. You're not in the mission, that's right, talking to the hipsters of Soma. And especially a product like Nextdoor, it's really for people's everyday lives. And what we found is that we got very strong positive feedback outside of Silicon Valley before it was even broadly adopted inside of Silicon Valley. So we're very focused at Nextdoor building something of real value and building something of long-term value and taking the long view of things. I think one of the things you always have to be careful in any entrepreneurial ecosystem and echo chamber, frankly, is just to be careful of, are we building something that is really improving people's lives? And when there's a lot of money that is available in the marketplace, I think a lot of dreams can get funded, but I encourage people to look pretty hard. Which are the ones that get through the seed round, the A round, the B round, and really start to impact people's lives? Those are the ones to bet on. And I think right now, we're still in a place where there are a lot of companies that are getting funded, not just in Silicon Valley, but I think across the entire market. And just look for that quality. Look for that quality is really important.
Are you now kind of on a world tour now to roll out internationally? Is this part of a sort of a European trip you're on?
We're lucky that we have offices in London, in Amsterdam, and here in Berlin, so getting a chance to visit all of them, as well as in Paris. I think one of the things that's most exciting, France is the country in which we launched most recently. We launched in early February, and I think the thing I'm most excited about is it has been one of our most successful launches to date. In fact, that team crossed over 100,000 users recently, and that is one of the fastest markets we've we've seen. So we're getting better and better at launching in these markets as we roll out, and that obviously bodes well as we expand into new markets going forward. And that's a function of both learning about how to roll out into new markets and improving the core product, which we continue to do on a regular basis.
Nice. Well, it's been fascinating to talk to you. I do hope you don't delete my fake account.
We're going to look at it,
I kind of need it, especially when I need to cut my grass with my neighbour's lawnmower. But for now, thank you so much, Sarah Leary from Nextdoor, for coming to Take Open Air.
Thank you, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.